So we're very privileged to have two prestigious international speakers this morning, and I'll start by introducing our first speaker for today. So we're privileged to be joined by Andreas Maercker. Andreas is a full professor and chair of psychopathology and clinical intervention at the University of Zurich. He has interests in trauma and stress-related disorders, and also in psychiatric nosology. He spent 10 years chairing a subcommittee at the WHO that worked on the ICD-10 revision in trauma and stress-related disorders. So I can't think of anyone better qualified to kick off our first session. So Andreas, over to you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Dear colleagues, good morning. Actually, artificial intelligence is not my content, but you will see probably how it may relate to the other content in the morning for you. Now, I'd like to get used to it. It works. This is my plan. I'd like to talk about the development of, let's say, brand new diagnoses. How do they develop? And I only chose a sample case on my special knowledge and my area, but you may transpose it to other applications as well. And if in case you want to establish a new diagnosis, please be reminded at my presentation in this morning. And how then it would relate to artificial intelligence, I will leave it up to you. So, benchmarks first, then how we did it in ICD-11, and then I will sum up something about the new disorders. Please don't expect from me not too much about content on the new disorders I'm going to present. The new disorders are here in green, and you may already know it, that they are new, and you may already know their definition. And I don't have a slide with defining them, only indirectly. So these are the sample case, and these are the 6 disorders of the grouping, as it is called, of disorders specifically associated with stress. Side remark, WHO was avoiding the term trauma in a title of a grouping because of its inflationary use in the world, particularly in under-resourced countries and circumstances, where they told us in our inaugural session, everything is either psychosis or trauma. So, these are the benchmarks. They actually are from an esteemed colleague here from Great Britain, Kendall, who used to be the president for a while of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and he suggested these 4 criteria for developing new diagnoses: existing acceptance among experts, uniform symptom pattern, uniform etiology and typical course, and existing specific treatment methods. I find it particularly interesting, number 4, because it's kind of out of the logic of old-fashioned psychopathology, but it's really, really important, and it's, of course, of use for us as clinicians, as practitioners, as we are. In the process of WHO's revision of ICD-11, the psychiatric chapter had some additional, let's say, working principles. And they called it the new science of clinical utility. They called it the principles of clinical utility. And here they are. They wanted us to increase the number of specific diagnoses, to decrease non-specific and not otherwise specified disorders. You know, we all love our subjects, be it psychiatry, clinical psychology or so, and we are mostly, almost 100%, we are convinced this is this diagnosis, that diagnosis, and third diagnosis. But if we come to, let's say, look closer to classification, for example, using this very restricted system of ICD-10 or in the future ICD-11, we often then have to fill in, instead of a true diagnosis, not otherwise specified, because some of the criteria or features are not fitting, and then we have to use this one. And this should, the development of ICD-11 wanted to solve this problem. Decreasing prevalences of comorbid disorders and avoidance of complex diagnostic algorithms, as we know it from DSM. I would say to you, they are really complex in some cases, for example, in the case of PTSD, but in other cases as well. And they are against the rule of human memory and of application in clinical practice, because we don't think 2 of this, 3 of this, 4 of this, and then some exclusion criteria. These are against the rules how our brain as clinicians works. How can we illustrate the process of differentiation in our fields? And this is a very simple schema that the grouping of trauma and stress-related disorders is kind of are parts from what we formerly all regarded as depressive or affective disorders. If we look back 30 years, with no PTSD diagnosis around, most of the cases who now would have been diagnosed with PTSD or with prolonged or complicated grief disorders belonged to this diagnosis of depressive or reactive depressive disorders, if some of you know this still. And here comes a new offspring. This is complex PTSD, one of our quote-unquote inventions. What are the steps in our development? We started with practitioners' surveys assessing the needs of clinicians for diagnosis use or even new diagnosis, and similarity ratings of diagnostic groups. Then we had our task force or work group formation. We then suggested disorder definitions in several steps. And finally, we had 2 kinds of studies, clinical studies with practitioners around the world, first online and the second in hospitals. This is a geographic illustration of the participants of the surveys of step 1 studies. And you see here the goal of WHO is always to be inclusive as possible with all parts of the world, and they kind of succeeded. And actually it was done with almost 5,000 psychiatrists, and a parallel study was done almost the same number with clinical psychologists around the world. And only one example of our findings. What did we find? We found the prevalences of disorders or diagnoses in daily practice. Has nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, with prevalences also, but the daily frequency in one's practice. And for our group, adjustment disorder was one of the most common diagnoses around the world. I know in different countries or even different regions or even different hospitals or schools have different uses of adjustment disorder had different uses. Now we revised its definition. And then PTSD was one of the other pretty common disorders as well. Here is a schema. I don't have time to go too much into detail of a similarity rating, still with ICD-10. It was for the preparation of let's say, the grouping or building categories or staying with categories, open it up to new categories. And it was using 3 kinds of dimensions: internalization versus externalization, developmental versus adulthood disorders, and functional versus organic. And please see here, I would say a not too far difference between PTSD and dissociative disorders. Actually, therefore, we had a discussion to bring both groupings or categories together, but still it was decided not to do it. And surprisingly, from a totally other field, more extended difference between 2 studies that in orange, paraphilic disorder and gender identity disorder. They are relatively far apart, and they were then put into 2 different groupings. So, but most important for the new disorders, my story I want to tell you, was the question in the surveys if the practitioners would like to have new diagnoses that are not existent so far. And the very first named among the psychiatrists and the international psychologists, the very first was complex PTSD, or some called it complex trauma. This gave us the specific work group, so to say, the task of developing the new disorder. This was the strongest impulse. And please look down at number 11. It then was named pathological bereavement. This was, let's say, a wish of some, at least some priority as well. And this was then the main justification, at least in the beginning, to consider a new disorder at this place. You find some other labels here, culture-related disorder. Yeah, probably it's not a nosological unit, but this need was expressed. So then a group was formed. The only country with 2 delegates was Great Britain. Then the rest of the world was very well represented. And we were an exception. We were the only work group with many, many NGOs in it because of the emergency aid of many NGOs. They were all delegates to our group. What did we do? We did research overviews, reviews of the literature, and always with a particular attention to low and middle income countries. Then we looked at best clinical practices, again, low and middle income countries, not to forget at all, to the contrary. We involved patient associations and had regional meetings. To make it at this point short, we came up with a proposal, and the proposal already had in the 2 new disorders, complex PTSD as kind of a spin-off, or as we call it more officially, a sibling disorder to PTSD, and prolonged grief disorder, kind of a spin-off to adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder actually was totally reformulated. It's now positively refined. It's not longer an exclusion category. It's positively defined, but I don't have time to tell you this story. We published these proposals in Lancet and World Psychiatry already 11 years ago. Probably few or some in the room already saw this. And this then was, let's say, making public what we wanted to suggest to the international, international group of our professions. The definitions of all the disorders, the newly reformed PTSD, classic PTSD actually was narrowed down to be the appropriate sibling to complex PTSD. We have this kind of ordering of the definition. It starts all with an event criterion. Then it comes to symptom characteristics. First, the core features. Then the additional features. For some reasons, I don't have time to explain, but it belongs to the change from operational definitions to typical typical definitions. It's not longer called criteria, but features. Then we have a time criterion. It remains a criterion, but I mean with the symptoms, there are features, not longer criteria. Psychosocial impairment criterion and developmental presentations over lifetime. And very important for our work, it was the cultural related characteristics. We got feedback, and one of the feedbacks I brought to you here came from the group of experts by experience. Actually, not only to our subchapter, but to all the mental health chapter in ICD 11. Our group's work was not criticized in this paper, which made it easier for us, although I think we already anticipated that their potential concerns. You may know that they mostly criticized the definitions in the psychosis and in the personality disorder subchapter. So I'm already coming to the field studies. Let me look to my watch. And the field studies, the first one, the online field study, was organized by a newly created internet consortium, the Global Clinical Practice Network. Its center was and is at the Columbia University in New York. And it, as you see here, it had, I think now the numbers are higher, 13,000 clinicians from 150 countries. And it had to evaluate the usability of the diagnostic proposals and the application to one's own clinical practice. For some of the more rare disorders were not tested within this clinical network, but our group was successful with all our, at least the adulthood disorders being included there. All of them were, as I mentioned, newly defined or totally new. And it looked like this here. All the participants in this Global Clinical Practitioners Network were given vignettes. And vignettes with, of course, varying content. And after the vignettes, there were short descriptions or even mid-sized descriptions of the new disorder definitions and its applications to developmental and cultural applications. And then the participants had to rate, is it, for example, classic PTSD, yes or no, and then the severity. Or is it just normal? Because we always tested the borderline from these disorders to normal. And just one slide for the results of these, what we called implementation studies. And the main outcome here is a percentage of agreement, or one could call it also reliability. And you see here that in most cases, the ICD solution outscores the PTSD solution. Here in complex PTSD, I didn't mention so far that there still is in ICD-10 a predecessor category, if you want. Actually, it's a little bit different. Enduring personality change after catastrophic experiences. And the reliability, let's say, steeply increased with complex PTSD. Adjustment disorder, at least somewhat, I told you. Totally different definition now with positive inclusion criteria. And prolonged grief disorder from the, how to say in English, firstly introduced, and it already reached over 90%, which was great. We were not so content with the, no, this is probably not, with 70%, we were not so content with the 71% for complex PTSD because it's still too low compared to 100%. And this then gave reasons to more specifically describe the features of complex PTSD to try to better describe it. The last study, the most or the effort needing study was, of course, then the hospital study around the world, and I can only give you, because of time reasons, one slide here, and I actually compare the reliabilities, in this case kappas, to another study from 5 years before, from DSM-5. DSM-5, when it came out in 2013, and then this study showing the reliabilities of the newly described DSM-5 disorders were surprisingly low. And I still remember myself sitting at my desk and thinking, oh, what a result with so low numbers. But at least for the other categories, ICD-11 for schizophrenia, bipolar, MDD, it was much better with ICD. The chapter I was working on was not so good. Still, look here, PTSD, classic PTSD, because of its narrowing down, for example, throwing away the previous intrusions, these sad involuntary thoughts about what happened. They are not longer a criterion, the sad, spontaneous memories. Only flashbacks are now a criterion of classic PTSD to prevent the overuse of this. And therefore, it was not bought by our clinicians. They still stayed with all kinds of sad memories about what happened in my life, are intrusions and are PTSD. And complex PTSD reached the number not too good, but yeah. And then we still had time before ICD-11 got official in 2019 to do additional revisions for the criteria, and then we did training around the world to improve the use of the newly defined disorders. So I come to my summary. We narrowed down, I told several times without giving you more details, classic PTSD and adjustment disorder. We created, or actually we supported previous proposals, to be honest. We supported previous proposals in the literature. You may know that for a long time, complex PTSD was suggested by an American colleague, Judith Lewis Herman, and prolonged grief disorder by 2 groups in the world, by Kathy Shear, and actually 3 groups, Marty Horowitz and Holly Priggerson. I wanted to show you this invention, other probably then totally different as the AI approach, involved a broad involvement of experts, of clinicians on all levels. And I didn't mention it during my presentation, but please take it as I tell you that the availability of specific treatments was very crucial for creating these new diagnostic entities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for that wonderful introduction into the complex process of disease classification and nosology in psychiatry. Let's see if we have some questions from the audience. That's Alistair, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I understand what you've done, and it's very impressive, but I just wanted to offer a comment just to see what you thought of it, which is that ultimately the diagnoses are used by not experts, but people. And people making trauma diagnoses are probably not referring back necessarily to the criteria. And I just wonder what you think about, I guess you might call it a looping of some sort, in which the diagnostic label is used, but the criteria gets weakened. What counts as trauma is diluted, and you end up with a diagnosis that starts to run away from your original definition.
Yeah, what you say is, I think, a very common experience of everybody of us. And I think, why not taking a very simplistic approach to say one thing is everyday language and the other one is our expert language. And you know, even me, I sometimes use trauma for things that are never traumatic events in our expert language. But you know, if talking with adults, with adolescents, and so it comes out of my mouth. And therefore, if we treat this as separate fields in the world, then it's okay, yeah? And trauma, you know, even then an old guy who speaks Greek language, he would say it's Wund. And yeah, we have all these loose associations, but this distinguishing is, I think, helpful.
Neeraj.
Thank you very much for a very clear talk. I'm still baffled about the reliability slide that you showed, because DSM-5 criteria are very specific, criterion-based. You would assume that they would lead on to hugely more reliability, and that's the reason why people prefer to use DSM rather than ICD in research. So it's very counterintuitive. How would you explain that?
Yeah, I would say it comes to the very complex nature of coming to a conclusion as originally specified in DSM-5. And all these numbers, these low numbers, mean that the clinicians change the algorithm or change the number of required symptoms at some point in their diagnostic process, even in participating academic hospitals around the world. Therefore, it's good in theory, and nobody will battle this, but it's not too good in practice.
Thank you.
Alan.
Thank you. It's a very clear talk. Can I ask a rather sort of nerdy question about process and how you dealt with the wider consultation? Because it's quite common when you do a wide consultation to log all the commentary you get and the committee's responses to it. And I don't think I saw that in ICD-11, although you may want to correct me and point to where it was. We had a slightly unsatisfactory experience with dissociative neurological symptom disorder, which is a rather ugly term. The entirety of the world calls these things functional neurological symptoms. And we wrote and just said, look, can't we just get on board and align with what everyone actually says in clinical practice? It was signed by 25 learned societies. And we never received a response. And I just wondered what the formal process was, because it felt a bit dismissive.
Yeah, you tip your finger on something that I have to acknowledge was not too well and publicly open organized. Actually, the involvement of colleagues was organized either by this kind of surveys or studies or statements of international, be it European, Asian, or South American groups of experts in our field, but not to individuals. But individuals got the impression if they emailed to ICD-11, because it was possible to send emails to them. They actually offered us this possibility. But if an individual had some suggestion, it was mostly neglected. And actually only this kind of international scientific associations were successful, even not national ones. And this was not publicly announced as it should have been. Therefore, when I was involved with some people, I always said, please look at the next regional, world region-wise association, and then give in your opinion with them, in a consensus with them. They were not able to treat properly the individuals that had five organizations in your case. And then you, in your case of dissociative disorders, I can tell you it's kind of you never find it in the literature. There were some extra problems with this category, the dissociative disorders. And I always tell in ICD-12, it may well be that dissociative disorders and trauma and stress disorders will go together. Let's see.